Hello, everyone. It's Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Robert E. Lee's birthday, January 19th, 2021. And today's talk is about a book written by Matthew Page Andrews in 1920. The title of it is Women of the South in War Times. I'm going to read an excerpt from that about a woman whose husband was with the 1st Tennessee Regiment, which was the same regiment in which Sam Watkins of Columbia, Tennessee, was a member. He wrote the famous memoir, Company Aytch, which was so often quoted during the Civil War documentary, PBS documentary, or in the early 1990s. So let me go ahead and get started with that. I'm going to read this episode. On the 1st of May, 1861, the little town of Pulaski, Tennessee, sent forth a company of volunteers for Confederate service. One of the men was John Sullivan, and when he went to the front, his wife, Mrs. Betsy Sullivan, accompanied him. The couple had no children, so Mrs. Sullivan determined not only to go to war, but also to, quote, mother the entire company as well. From the time that she helped to nurse the first sick or wounded soldier to the surrender of the Confederate forces, this noble Irish woman was known as Mother Sullivan. There was nothing the men would not dare for her and for what her presence represented to them, their wives, their mothers, and their homes. In turn, Mrs. Sullivan held in her long years of hardship with the Army that no trial was too severe, no sacrifice too great if made on behalf of her boys, which was a term she used for the soldiers of the company and later the regiment. In 1917, the story of Mrs. Sullivan's war experiences was set forth by Mrs. Grace Meredith Newbill in the following brief narrative. Tenderly and lovingly, as a real mother, she administered to the soldiers in sickness and closed their eyes in death. She mended and darned for them, cooked dainty food for their sick, and in many instances washed the clothes of the sick and wounded. Mrs. Sullivan went with the 1st Regiment to West Virginia in General Lee's campaign against General Rosecrans, and thence to Northern Virginia when the regiment was under Stonewall Jackson. What she means by Northern Virginia there is really northern part of what is now West Virginia, right near the Potomac River, not far from the Mason-Dixon line. She marched on foot with her knapsack on her back through the mountains of West Virginia, slept on the frozen ground under the cold skies, a blanket her only covering, her knapsack her pillow. In a slight skirmish at Cheat Mountain, West Virginia, one member of Company K was killed. Mrs. Sullivan brought the body of the dead soldier in a rude wagon to the nearest railway station, where it was prepared for burial, then on to his home in Pulaski, and gave into the hands of his loved ones their precious dead. When importuned to remain at home with her friends and receive the care she so much needed, she replied, quote, no, my boys need me. I must go to them, close quote. With sublime self-sacrifice, she shared every hardship endured by the men of the 1st Regiment. In return, the soldiers loved and reverenced her, treating her at all times with the same courtesy they would have shown to their own mothers. No rude speech or improper word was ever uttered in her presence by her devoted boys, meaning the soldiers. Only a few days ago, I heard a veteran of the 1st Tennessee affirm that not one single man in the entire regiment would have hesitated to spill the last drop of blood for Mother Sullivan. Early in the spring of 1862, the 1st Regiment was ordered back to Tennessee. Mrs. Sullivan went with the regiment and in 1862 was with her boys on the battlefields of Shiloh and Corinth. at that time, there really wasn't a battle at Corinth, but there certainly was at Shiloh. Not in the rear, working in a hospital, but in the battleground with her boys carrying bandages with canteens of water suspended from her shoulders. She bound up the wounds and staunched the lifeblood of many soldiers, moistened the lips of the dying, and closed the eyes of the dead. At Perryville, Kentucky, October 1862, Mrs. Sullivan was on the battlefield in one of the bloodiest and most hotly contested battle of any during the war. Here, her husband sustained a severe head wound, and Lieutenant John Woolridge of the same company, Company K, suffered the loss of both eyes. When General Bragg retreated from Kentucky, these wounded men were left at Harrodsburg and became prisoners. Mrs. Sullivan went with them to prison, where she continued to serve her husband and other members of the company as long as she was able. Now, I want to note that 1st Tennessee Regiment, as I say, was also the Sam Watkins Regiment. He was in Company H. She was in Company K. But she speaks of the Battle of Perryville. Sam Watkins tells that battle. They both charged Starkweather Hill, and his description of that battle in Company Aytch is riveting. And he also talks about the time that he was in the northern part of West Virginia, as Mrs. Sullivan's story relates. It was very cold that winter, and Sam told a tall tale. He was so, I guess, frustrated with the cold. In his memoirs, he said, you know, he was out, I don't know, on duty, I guess sentinel duty, and he came upon a group of about a half a dozen soldiers who were also had been on sentinel duty, and he was to relieve them, and they were frozen in place. Well, that's a tall tale. And Sam Watkins had a tendency to tell those in his memoir, Company Aytch. But this version of Company Aytch, which is mine, has 250 annotations, and it separates the tall tales from fact, and also provides maps to show where he was in each one of these battles. It describes, for example, on a map where Starkweather's Hill was at the Battle of Perryville. Now, you can get a copy of this at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. I think it's $16 or $15. But if you'd like to get an autographed copy from me, you can do that by contacting me, Phil _Leigh, LEIGH @me.com. So for $18, I'll autograph the book. And if you're here in the United States, I will pay the postage. Now, I do want to also continue with a story about that Watkins writes that is funny. So let me just do that. Mark Twain first achieved fame 7 months after Lee's surrender at Appomattox with his short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, a story about a shrewd frontier gambler who tricks a California gold prospector. Now, the miner owns a pet frog that has outjumped every frog in the county. While the miner is occupied catching a new frog for the gambler to wager against the miner's champion frog, the gambler feeds the prospector's frog buckshot. When the miner returns, the speculator declares that the freshly caught frog is a suitable contender and places his wager on the new frog. To the dismay of all, save one, the champion frog won't budge, and the cheater wins. And the champion frog, of course, is weighted down with that buckshot that the gambler fed him while the prospector was out hunting for a new frog to give to the gambler to put in the race. Okay, Sam Watkins tells of a similar story, but a true incident. several years earlier when his Confederate Army was idled for 7 weeks in Tupelo, Mississippi. This was after the Battle of Shiloh. Bragg's army waited around for about 7 weeks in northern Mississippi before going to Chattanooga and then to Kentucky. Anyway, to overcome the boredom, the soldiers would wager on most anything, including how fast lice would run off of a tin plate. One soldier was constantly winning until the others figured out he always heated his plate before the race. Okay, that's our show. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Phil Lee signing off for today.